If you enjoy watching mockumentaries or docu-series or whatever they're called, you should read Josephus, because the stuff that went on in the history and the way he portrays it is just amazing. And we're going to talk a little bit about Josephus throughout, because he's going to be the source of some of the material that we're going to be talking about. But he talks about how Claudius appointed Felix at the urging of the high priest Jonathan, who was in Rome at that time, protesting how the current procurator, Cumanus, had been handling the Jewish uprisings. And these riots were serious. They started with the murder of a Jew by a Samaritan, and Cumanus had done nothing about it. And it resulted in 30,000 Jews dying. So these riots were pretty serious. It wasn't just a gathering. It was a riot where 30,000 people died. And Felix is complaining about it to Claudius, and Cumanus is going to get let go. And because Felix is one of the favorites in the Claudius household, he's going to be the obvious choice to replace him. Now, part of that interesting story is Felix actually has the high priest Jonathan killed that same year by some of the assassins that the high priests would utilize to do some of the nefarious things that the high priests would do that, they weren't supposed to be doing. So it's interesting that the guy who appoints him, he ends up killing within a year. And that's the governor that's going to be hearing Paul's trial. Now, Felix is going to be known as a brutal and firm-handed governor over the province, and he's going to serve between AD 52 and 60, according to Hemer. He's going to give the appearance of peace, and that was what he was being put there for, but history shows that there was still widespread violence and uprisings, and while he was left to deal with all the problems Cumanus left, he really didn't do a great job fixing it either, no matter what the beginning of the trial makes you believe, with the special kind, friendly words that both folks are going to articulate. Now, I want to take us back to a couple of weeks ago, because one of the things that Felix had done a poor job with was dealing with a murderous group called the Sicarii. Now, the Sicarii, if you recall, I mentioned a couple of weeks ago about this out of the blue verse that discusses this Egyptian assassin. And it was back in 21, verse 38. Then you are not the Egyptian who before these days raised a revolt and led out into the wilderness the 4,000 men of the assassins. And I thought, well, that was kind of out of the blue. The Sicarii were this Egyptian group of assassins. The Sicarii group is associated with revolt, robbery, and assassinations. They were known for hiding a small carved dagger in their clothes. And Josephus makes the Sicarii the bad guys in just about everything. So they're the boogeymen. The Sicarii and the boogeymen are probably a pretty good parallel. It says, Brighton in the Sicarii in the Acts, he says, in the ancient world, the term Sicarii could have applied to a range of people and groups, but was most likely associated with a political insurrection. About 600 Sicarii, according to Josephus, were involved in a revolt in Egypt. Now, I mentioned Josephus, so I think it's kind of important for me just to say this about ancient historians. And technology isn't working great down here or up here either, so let me just read it from... Ancient historians don't typically take it the way we would expect historians to receive the facts and portray the facts. Job of a historian notably is different at this time. While modern history stresses, or at least tries to stress, a commitment to the facts, ancient history was also an exercise in rhetoric, and we're going to talk about rhetoric. At that time, the historians were expected to try to convince their audience of their interpretation of events. It was also considered appropriate to write history as it should have happened, even if this involved citing events that did not occur or changed the behavior of the characters involved. Now, I found that funny because it seems like various groups like to rewrite history, and it doesn't seem that it's changed that much, though I guess we at least don't portray the knowledge that that's what's going on. They readily admitted that was the role and goal of the historian. So when you do read Josephus, understand that he had a motivation, and he was also trying to motivate. Now, we just discussed Felix. Now, there's also Ananias. Ananias is going to be the high priest who presided over the Sanhedrin Council. He's appointed the high priest by Herod Agrippa II, and he's going to serve for 12 years. According to Josephus, Ananias was wealthy, insolent, cruel, and greedy. He collaborated with Romans against the Jews. He was killed by the Jews when they rebelled against Rome in AD 66. Now there's a third person, and this is the one that I find so interesting, and this is Tertullus. Tertullus, and Kaufman quotes John Peter Lang, and I love this. When people come to my office, a lot of times I tell them that what we're trying to accomplish is a situation where you don't have to deal with attorneys and judges, because that's a class of people that a lot of people don't want to have to deal with it on a daily basis. And then I also add, I'm hoping that my office changes that attitude a little bit. But the truth of the matter is, attorneys and judges don't really have a high respect in society from certain aspects, at least. And it's funny that Kaufman, quoting John Peter Lang, puts this Tertullus into this same kind of category. He says, having been foiled as a mob and their 40 conspirators earlier in chapter 23, having been left holding the bag, the high priest and company now tried another approach. The cunning assassination and conspiracy have failed, so they're going to try the tinsel of oratory, attempting to gain their desire by flattery. He also uses the word mercenary a few times, which I thought was interesting. But you have to understand, the ancient courts, they didn't have attorneys. It's not attorneys like we have today. The Roman courts, they had what we call rhetor, the rhetorical, the orator. This person was specialized in training. This person would have had, like law school, except instead of learning law, it was more about persuasion. And you have to understand that they would have gone to special training in rhetoric and become very familiar with the Roman system of law so that they could help their clients prepare and take their side of the case forward. And that's what he would have had in this case. Now, he would have been trained in one of several different styles. Demetrius's On Style is one book that explains a lot of the training that went on for the orator. Quintilian, who had the quote that was completely jarbled up there when we started, his Institute for Oratory was also a great sample of training. And then, of course, Aristotle's Rhetoric is a fantastic book on understanding persuasion. And so his training would have come with this background, and there's so many scholars and academics and folks that take the first portion of how Tertullus is going to approach Felix, and they talk about what a perfect example of both Tertullus and Paul provided history with some aspects of this type of trial, especially this portion of the trial that typically was not found in what they did as transcripts. They would put the facts and do this, but there's a certain section of the debate, if you will, or the case that they didn't really record in a lot of instances. So they talk about how what we're going to talk about to start the actual trial is a fantastic sample of these opening comments. And we talked about these kind of opening comments before. I mentioned, it's common that when somebody gets up here, for them to say something nice, because we all like to have something nice said to us, right? It's a good start if somebody gets up here and says something nice to you guys. You guys are a pillar of the community. You guys are a good-looking crowd. You guys are all these wonderful things. Now you like me, right? That worked. Well, that's called something. That actually has a description. That's called captatio benevolente. And this is the opening section of a trial. And this is a device known to build rapport. And the prosecutor in this case, Tertullus, is going to build rapport with Felix. He might even lie a little. Marcus Fabius Quintilius taught, "We shall win the goodwill of the judge not merely by praising him, which must be done, but with tact and as an artifice use things that link the praise to furthering their cause, their case." So it wasn't good enough just say, "You're a good-looking crowd." He was going to have to tie the actual facts that were in his favor to the praise, the flattering, the exaggeration. And Stephen Loesch is going to call this portion of Tertullus' speech a masterpiece of exquisite rhetorical artistry. Bruce Winter, in his article, Importance of Captatio Benevolente, and how it applies to the forensic speeches here in Acts 24. He says, "It has provided an invaluable tool for establishing the intention of these speeches. Luke, in summarizing these forensic presentations from primary sources, both understood and made careful use of the important relationship of this section of the speech to the body of the speech." And it's important to understand that a lot of people in the academic world, especially in the theology world, want to say that Luke didn't really give us the real words of things that happened. That a lot of times he would, they say this is Luke's theology a lot of times. They want to take away from the literal historicity of it and make it more of Luke's theology. But Stephen Loesch, in his article, points to this as being one of those moments where these would be words that prove Luke that he was bringing what actually happened. It's a fascinating side study if you want. Now, as we have now seen the characters, just keep in mind when we start this trial, you're going to be looking for certain things. Now, remember Lysias had sent Paul to Caesarea under armed guard because there was that plot to assassinate him, and that sending him with armed guards rescues him from the assassination, but it's not going to save him from the political jeopardy or the legal jeopardy that he's found himself from all of this. So Paul's case is being transferred from the proconsul to the highest official in the province, which is governor or the procurator. He's going to be formally on trial. A complaint has been sent, and he's formally on trial. And he's going to be on trial with a very significant representative of the Gentile world. And it's suggested that Luke includes this trial for three main purposes. First purpose is Paul's going to defend himself against false charges. Remember, Luke's already told us that these are false charges. Previously, in a previous chapter, he said this is all false. But Paul defends himself against the false charges against the highest authority in the province. He's also going to continue his defense of Christianity against the Jewish opponents. And lastly, and this is one of the things that we can really take from this lesson, is Paul's going to bear witness to the governor. He's taking his situation, his plight, and he's always applying where he is, who he is with, to his main goal of taking the word to those that need to hear it. He's going to fulfill that prophecy that Jesus said back in Luke 21, verses 12 through 13. But before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and will persecute you, handing you over to the synagogues and prisons. You will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will turn out to you for a time of witness. So, watch for the witness. Two themes are going to be central in this chapter. We're going to see things that Luke really hasn't talked about in worship. And it's an interesting conversation about worship because he's going to use both words that get utilized for it, and we'll have more discussion on that. That's the liturgical side of Acts 24. And then there's the saving faith, which is the eschatological side of this. So Paul's going to proclaim, and he's going to continue to proclaim that he's a pious Jew, and he's going to be speaking about worship in both service and worship. He's going to be using the word proskenesian, which is to bow down. That is the worship. He's also going to be using the word latruo, which is the word for service. And this word expresses a concept of religious service as duty. And we actually saw that in use last time when I pulled up Romans 12:1, because that's latruo, that's the service. And in Romans 9:4 and Hebrews 9:6, it's going to refer to temple service that was given in Israel. And then, of course, in Romans 12:1, Paul's going to exhort his readers to present their bodies as a living sacrifice, and says that it is a reasonable service. He describes his life and ministry as a Christian, and I want you to listen for the words, according to the way. Dr. Ben Witherington is going to contend that this trial is going to be presented in this oratorical duel with these two very accomplished rhetoricians, and they're going to offer us a piece of what he calls forensic rhetoric. He's also pointing out that some of the unusual things about this trial is the accusers are going to make these vague accusations. That's unusual because the Roman justice, the accuser would allege facts against the accused, and it wasn't really necessary to produce hard evidence. But while you didn't have to produce hard evidence or even witnesses, you have to remember that just invites the Roman official to evaluate and deal with the matter however he pleased. So there's some unusual things about this, but Witherington also notes that the burden of proof is on the accuser, and that the judge had flexibility in establishing what the crime was. So it's sort of like if you got accused of something and you went before a judge, and the judge got to decide what you did wrong instead of what the charge was. I can say that makes it very problematic. It makes the job of the defense attorney very difficult if the judge just gets to change everything. The judge also had the ability, as we'll see in this one, to immediately make the decision or postpone it however he saw fit. Now, Paul is going to handle his own defense, and he's going to defend himself with great skill. He's going to refute the charges, and one commentator describes it this way: by prescribing the limits of the evidence based on Roman law, prescribing the charges of absent accusers, using forensic terminology, and not least of all, presenting a well-argued defense, even if preserved in summary form. So he's going to do a good job in his defense, and it's going to be really important. There's going to be some key moments for you to recognize when Paul points these things out against his accusers. Now, Paul, remember, was guarded for 5 days in Herod's Praetorium before the high priest would come down from Caesarea with some of the elders and their professional advocate, Tertullus. Now, Paul's accusers were anxious to expedite these proceedings using the very best possible legal assistance, so they brought Tertullus with them so they could bring the charges before the governor. This was a formal process by which a trial was set in motion, with the accused not yet being there to answer. And you'll see in verses 2 through 4, when Paul was called in, Tertullus is going to present his case before Felix. And he begins the speech with that rhetorical device that we talked about, captatio benevolente. And this is going to involve some complimentary exaggeration. Remember, he says, "We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you." Now, we've already presented that these riots happened, that he was still a lot of violent things going on. So this might be just a tad bit of exaggeration. Might even be flattering lies. But thank you for carefully linking this introduction is going to carefully link these charges with this example of flattery. Remember, he's saying, you've kept the peace. What is Paul going to be accused of? Disturbing the peace, okay? You've kept the peace, so we're calling on you. We're calling on you for this. Tertullus is going to further claim that it was because of the governor's foresight or providence that many reforms had happened in the Jewish nation. Speaking on their behalf, Tertullus is going to claim that this was acknowledged everywhere. We all know you're the great Felix who has caused these wonderful things to happen, that's kept all the disturbances down. And I'm going to request you, Felix, to be kind enough to hear us briefly. Now, the word translated kind, also, it's not the word we hear there. Kind there is going to be a reasonableness or fairness. So when he says, we request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly, he's saying, we want you to be fair, but remember all those things that he's going to be accused of, because they're opposite of all the great wonders that you've done for us. The basis of the appeal is going to be a fair hearing, and the essence of the charge is going to be set out in the section of the speech that's also known as the narratio. Now, speaking on behalf of his clients again, he declares, we have found this man to be a troublemaker, a loimon, a plague, a pest, a pestilent fellow, stirring up riots, stices. Now, among the Jews all over the world. So he's saying not only did he do this in Jerusalem, but he's been this troublemaker throughout the world. Now, stasis has a range of meaning in Acts, which means from disturbance to riot. You can see that in chapters 15 and 19, and we saw it in chapter 23. But rebellion and the creation of civil disturbance, we've discussed, is a capital offense. So what they're charging him of is a capital offense. And it's not just something that's going to be prisonable. It is prisonable, but it is something that if it rose to the level in which they're describing, the Rome would want him killed. The socio-political effect of Paul's ministry was being highlighted as the danger for all of Christianity as well. So it's not just Paul, but this whole Christian movement is dangerous to the empire. And Paul is being likened to a dangerous disease which must be stopped before it infects everyone. So the seriousness of the charge is that Paul, a Nazarene, which by the way is only typically utilized for Jesus, but in this way, he's being called a ringleader of a sect that has desecrated the temple. And in religious terms, that is a violent, that's why the Jews had the violent response they had. Now, this alone should be enough in the offense. It has serious political implications from the Roman viewpoint, and it would, if true, render a death penalty. Now, the climax of Tertullus's assertions is that the temple desecration was the main reason for Paul's captivity. He says, so we seized him. Now, it's a bit disingenuous because if you recall, it wasn't the desecration that caused the reason why Paul was arrested. It was the riot that was caused by the arrest that got Paul arrested. And Tertullus conveniently omits to say that the riot in Jerusalem, the thing that the Romans would have been most upset about, was actually caused by the Jews and what they did thereafter. So Paul is going to get to answer these things, and the closing lines for Tertullus here is asking the governor himself to cross-examine Paul about the accusations. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about all these charges we are bringing it against him. So Paul's going to defend himself in verses 10 through 23. And when the governor motioned to him to speak, Paul began his response with his brief capatio benevolente, just like Tertullus had done. In a more restrained fashion, though, he's going to say he's glad to make his defense before Felix. knowing that for a number of years he had been a judge over this nation. Now, he hadn't been a governor, but he had been in the proconsulship in a senatorial province. So he had been in as like a junior colleague to Cumanus before his appointment as the procurator. So he has had experience, and that's what Paul's pointing out. And Paul's going to acknowledge him as judge with an experience in these kind of matters relating to the Jewish people and these type of cases and disputes. Now, in verses 11 through 13, Paul's going to proceed to establish several lines of defense in making the use of Tertullus's own words to build his own case. So basically, he's going to try to show the governor, hey, we've got some common points here. I'm going to agree with him on these things. But he's going to angle them to make sure the Felix sees that what Tertullus is alleging is not a crime within Roman law. First, he asserts that he's a pious Jew by going up to Jerusalem to worship. And this is the proskynesion. This is the bowing down. And he was doing so by giving an offering. And that offering was going to be intended to not just the Christian Jews. It was to the Jews and the Jewish nation. It was to the temple. And he's going to make a point that he's paying homage to God, which is a formal act of worship. He's going to refer to the practice of idolatry. In verses 17 and 18, he's going to show his intention to use the temple appropriately as a faithful Jew and not to desecrate it. His second line of defense was to question the reliability of the accusers, claiming that they did not find him arguing or doing anything in the temple or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues or anywhere else in the city. The synagogue in this context appears to those to be in Jerusalem. So that comment about, and he stirred up trouble throughout the world, well, he's just dealing with the Jerusalem incident right here, but they've said he stirred up riots everywhere, and he's saying they didn't find me stirring up anything. In respect, he's going to contest that they can't prove to you that the charges they are now making against me. Nobody's going to be able to say they found me stirring up riots here or all over the world. The third defense, he's going to appeal to Felix he's going to take a very interesting approach. He's going to give a confession. He's going to admit about some of the distinctive beliefs and practices that he was doing, and he's going to show that this confession was not of a crime, but he's going to identify himself as fellow Jews by speaking about latreo, the act of service, the act of service for God and the ancestors. That word, it can refer to the service. It can refer to the service of God in everyday life or to particular expressions of devotion in that cultic context. So, with these words, Paul's going to differentiate himself from the Jews, identifying himself as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. The Jews call those of the follower of the way a sect. And the way appears to have been a self-designation favored by the Christians. But sect was the term favored by the non-Christians, the non-Christian Jews. Paul's going to serve the God of the Old Testament according to the way of Jesus and his followers. But by claiming to be the way, the earliest Jewish disciples were insisting that they were the true Israel, experiencing the promised blessings of the Messianic era through faith in Jesus rather than being one of several groups within the people of God. So against this background, the Jewish opponents of Christianity appear to have used this word sect to imply that Christians were some type of heresy, some type of breakaway group, something that the Romans should take notice of. Paul's going to further explain that he worships by confessing. He's saying, I believe everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets. He's going to interpret the law and the prophets as a follower of the way, but with respect to biblical eschatologic eschatology. He implicitly, once more, is going to identify himself with the Pharisees. Now, I find that interesting because we've tried so hard to make sure everybody knows that we're not Pharisaical. And Paul, over and over again, has put himself in a position of the Pharisees for a very specific reason. I'm not trying to say Pharisaical stuff's okay. I'm just saying for the purpose of understanding resurrection and for purpose of siding with a very powerful group, he's making sure that they see that he sides with them on this very important issue, because the Sadducees, on the other hand, didn't. So this was definitely one of those, hey, he's one of us moments. Scott did a great job talking about the he's one of us moments and what conflict that would have created in the Sanhedrin when he got one side to be with him. He's one of us. Now, there's no resurrection of Jesus being mentioned here, but it's the idea of general resurrection from death. And I want to point out that it does bring in both the faithful and those that are not. It's going to talk about both sides of things. It's not just going to be the good side of resurrection. It's going to also be, there's something for those adulterous folks. So the idea of judgment is definitely portrayed in what he has to say. And such an appeal to this common hope and desire to serve God is designed to counter the charge that he's a destroyer of Judaism, challenging his accusers to recognize the genuineness of his relationship with God. And he's going to conclude his appeal to Felix, claiming that in his most recent behavior, he was above reproach. He didn't do anything wrong. No accuser has stepped forward to be able to say he's done anything wrong from a technical standpoint. Luke has Paul declare that the gifts were for his nation rather than for the Christian Jews. He has respect for the law in verse 14. He was ceremonially clean, we remember. Denying the charge of being a deliberate troublemaker, Paul's going to indicate that those who accused him of the wrong in the first place, some in Jerusalem and those outside of Jerusalem in the world that are bringing the charges, should be the ones present to bring the charges if they have anything against him. Roman law is going to be pretty clear about if somebody abandons their charges, the failure of the witness to appear before the governor suggests the charge should be that it couldn't be proved. Now, they're not necessary, but if they're called and they don't show, it's dropped. Very similar to today's judicial process. Paul's going to be making this objection, and this objection alone is sufficient for dismissal. But he's going to continue that these who are here should state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin. And then if you remember in verse 10 of chapter 23, they didn't make a ruling. They didn't find that he had done anything wrong. They had basically ended it without a decision because of the chaos caused by the he's one of us over theological issues. And he's going to highlight this once more. He's going to say, unless it is with this one thing that I shouted in their presence concerning resurrection of the dead, then I'm on trial for basically theological matters. This is going to cause a serious problem for the Jewish accusers because their claim to the governor, there's really no legal basis for it. It is completely a theological issue. Paul has made his accusers witness in his own. He's made his accusers witness on his behalf because all they've ever spoken about is theological matters. Verse 22, we're going to see Felix is familiar with the way. And at this point, he recognizes that this is not a matter that he needs to be ruling on without further witness. And we're going to see that in just a second. So he's going to adjourn the proceedings. He had no intention of being drawn into an internal Jewish dispute or of doing some injustice to a man whose only offense lay in what other Jews regarded as an unorthodox theology. His adjournment is going to be explained because of the knowledge of the way, and partly because he wants to hear the evidence from Lysias, the commander. So Felix tells Paul's accusers that when Lysias comes, I will decide your case. And remember, Lysias, from the Roman perspective, was the only independent witness. But we have no way of knowing whether Lysias appeared before the governor to give evidence or not. But we do know that nothing ever happened for like 2 years, as has pointed out to me as I came in today. But in verse 23, meanwhile, Felix is going to order the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom. Now, this leads us into a really interesting section, the conclusion of the chapter, which I hope we can quickly get through, because we're going to see Felix and his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, going and visiting Paul, and another opportunity. Now, Paul has given witness to the governor, Felix. Now he's going to give witness to his wife, who was Jewish. Now, Drusilla had previously been married to Azizus, king of Emesa, and she was the youngest daughter of Herod Agrippa I, sister of Herod Agrippa II. And Josephus records that Felix wooed her away from her husband, causing her to transgress the laws of her forefathers through adultery. Now, the Herods weren't really Jewish. They weren't fully Jewish. They just made this facade of Jewishness. But they understood what being a Jew was about. They understood what was going on. They understood the Jewishness of what Paul had stood for and what the accusers had stood for. And privately, Paul did not hesitate to develop this theme with the governor and his wife. He's going to make a presentation of the gospel to a Gentile and presumably his wife who had the Jewish connection. Genuine faith in Christ involves a change of allegiance, he would tell them, and therefore a change in behavior and priorities. Paul presented his challenges in terms that were particular to them. Just like we've seen over and over again with Paul, his apologetic is to take the person and apply those things in their life and those things that they would be able to wrap their hands around and grasp. And he would explain these things. Now, we recognize that Felix may have had an ulterior motive for these visits. It's stated that he was looking for a bribe, which, by the way, was against the Roman law as well, but we've already seen that if he had Jonathan assassinated, I don't think he's above asking for a little money on the side. Now, why he thought Paul would have money or his friends would have money, I guess might be related to the givings that he was sending to Jerusalem, but it's still, to think he's going to get a bribe. And it's interesting that Felix never makes a ruling, and as pointed out, we don't know if Lysias actually came or not, but we know he never made a ruling. And he's going to be relieved of his position, and the impending new governor. This would have been a good time for him just to let Paul go, but he wanted to have a good relationship with the Jews as well, from a standpoint of when he went to Rome, he didn't want bad reports. So he just gave this as like a courtesy to the Jews. We're just going to keep him. We're going to keep him imprisoned and not release him. Now, in Acts 24, what we've seen is Paul not only gets to defend himself, but he's going to make the case of Christianity. And he's going to make the case that Christianity is not opposed or a threat to Rome or any state, actually. At the same time, he's going to bear witness to a Gentile, to a Roman governor, Felix, and his wife. He's also made witness to his Jewish accusers. He is going to establish and show the beliefs that determine his life and ministry. He's a model of clarity, insight, and wisdom. And as one commentator put it, he's a model of clarity, insight, and wisdom as he seeks to persuade about the real issues at stake in his situation and in the plan of God for Israel and the nations. It is a fascinating study. If you like side things, the knowing who these folks are, reading Josephus's backstories, you go to YouTube and watch about the Sicarii. I mean, there's so much in here that's you can chase rabbits. But the thing that we really should take from it is that Paul took every opportunity. It would have been easy just to sit back and do nothing. But he took every opportunity to continue to establish and show his faith to every segment of the people that he was dealing with. I think we've only got a few weeks left of Acts, which is sad, but it's exciting that we'll be moving on to a new study in January. I really appreciate the opportunity today. You guys have a wonderful week.